Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Daniel Gómez Steinhart, Assistant Professor of Cinema Studies at the University of Oregon. Steinhart's research and teaching focus on global Hollywood, production studies, film aesthetics, independent film, and contemporary international art cinema. His first book, Runaway Hollywood, Internationalizing Postwar Production and Location Shooting, was published in 2019. As a 2018-19 Oregon Humanities Center teaching fellow, Steinhart developed and taught the class Hollywood film style during the 2018 fall quarter. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start at the beginning. How do you define cinema studies as a discipline?
I think, I think we need to think broadly in terms of cinema studies, and it doesn't just incorporate study of film, but media broadly. So that would include television, new media, video games, and I think that that also reflects sort of the realities of the industries. If you look at who owns the film and media today, it's really a set of organizations, of corporations. And so I think even looking at the kind of industrial connections, all these things are intertwined. At the same time, I think we can look at each individual media, film, TV, and ask very specific questions about each of these.
And in our cinema studies program, you guys deal with all of this, yes?
We do, yeah. So it's sort of cinema studies with an asterisk, meaning it's the study of film, TV, and media.
Great. So what led to your interest in cinema studies?
I think, I didn't have any kind of unremarkable connection to film and media growing up. I think I was like anyone. I watched a lot of movies growing up. I was very much a part of the video cassette generation, going to the video store, recording movies off of television. But I think when it started to become more serious for me was perhaps in high school. I had an older brother. I think like some people who have older siblings, your tastes are very much informed by their tastes. And so he was really interested in film, and so was his friends. And I remember he went to Italy for a year abroad in college, and he was telling me about things that he was discovering, filmmakers like Fellini. So I tracked that down, and that, I think, opened things up for me. I think I also became interested in film in the mid-1990s when there was very much a kind of flourishing of independent cinema in the United States. Filmmakers like Spike Lee, Jim Jarmusch, Richard Linklater, and that was really exciting to me. And so, when I went to college, I became very interested in studying cinema, although I think I gravitated more towards filmmaking, and that's actually what I studied, focused more on in college, but then eventually I kind of switched gears into thinking more critically about film.
So, you mentioned your brother's influence. He goes to Italy, and then you mentioned your interest in art, independent films in the U.S. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about your first book, Runaway Hollywood, Internationalizing Postwar Production and Location Shooting. It seems to me that it's interesting, given those two things, to think about this book a little bit. But the first thing is the title, not the subtitle, the title, Runaway Hollywood. Right. Explain that.
Yeah, so that really refers to the term runaway production. And so this was a term that originated with Hollywood unions who were trying to identify a phenomenon, which is that in the late 1940s, more Hollywood films were starting to be shot overseas, which caused a great deal of anxiety amongst Hollywood unions, which were already in a kind of precarious position, facing a lot of changes in the industry. And so they were really concerned about the loss of employment opportunities. So they came up with this term, which is really kind of a pejorative term. Yeah, right. I mean, it kind of has a charge of of weakness, of opportunities that were fleeing Hollywood. So they really anchored their campaigns against this phenomenon with that term runaway production. And so I wanted to foreground that. I do deal with the labor situation and how Hollywood unions reacted to that. But I also go into what was the experience like for those filmmakers who did go overseas, and what was the effect of that move on the films themselves. But for me, that sort of labor question was central, and so I really wanted to foreground it by using that title, Runaway Hollywood.
And your methodology is you're interested in aesthetics, you're interested in industry, and you're interested in labor, yes?
Right. Yeah. So, this is a book of film history, but I was really interested in looking at how those different areas interacted. So, that really kind of spoke to the type of research I was going to do. So, to do the industry component, I was looking at studio records, primarily in Los Angeles. There's a political component which led me to go to the National Archives in Maryland to look at the State Department files to understand how embassies and consulates were tracking this phenomenon. But ultimately I wanted to understand what the effect of this move was on the films themselves. And at the end of the day, I'm kind of most interested in the movies themselves. Mm-hmm. And so the thing that was most striking about it is that when you look at these movies, they're still Hollywood movies. Mm-hmm. They're not making Italian neorealist movies, even if they're working in Italy. They're not making French New Wave films, even if they're working in France. But there is a slight change, which is that locations become more emphasized in these movies. They become foregrounded, and so I wanted to hone in on that aspect of the films.
So why did Hollywood want to do that? Why did directors, producers start going to Europe to make films?
So I think we can look at two different reasons. The first one is financial. So after World War II, in Europe, which was really the primary staging ground for these runaway productions, you had a lot of fragile economies. And so these governments, European governments, would freeze the foreign earnings of Hollywood studios in order to keep that money locally and to force Hollywood to invest it locally. And I think the idea was that maybe Hollywood would invest in infrastructure, in French films, Italian films, British films, and to a certain extent it did that. But Hollywood, thinking very kind of aggressively and how to kind of exploit this situation, instead really invested that funds in their own films, but shot overseas. So that was the first primary reason. After that, there were additional financial incentives. There were subsidies in places like Great Britain that Hollywood companies could take advantage of. There's also personal tax incentives that stars and directors could take advantage of by working overseas for a certain amount of time. It was a tax dodge. So those are the financial reasons, but I think we can also look at aesthetic reasons, which was the authenticity of place. I mean, for decades, Hollywood had recreated foreign settings on backlots, on sound stages, but now Hollywood filmmakers were going to the real thing, so going to Paris, going to the jungle in the Congo. So that became, I think, an important way to sell the movies. And we also have to remember this was a period when there was a lot of competition from television. And so this was another way to differentiate the product alongside other developments like widescreen technology. More films were being shot in color. So filmmakers could kind of pair the authenticity of location with these other new stylistic developments to sell movies.
So I know that one of the things the book does is you sort of lay out parameters for films that will fit in your model. So you said these are Hollywood films.
Right.
So what are the characteristics that distinguish these particular films that are being shot, I mean, what's Hollywood about them and what's not Hollywood about them?
Right, yeah, it's a great question, and I think I try to take a lot of pains to justify why I'm looking at these particular films. So it's a set of criteria. Firstly, they have to have some sort of financing from a Hollywood studio, and some of that could come from foreign earnings, some of that could come from direct financing. So that's a big part of it. Also, certain positions on crews had to be represented by Hollywood filmmakers. So for the most part, they would be Hollywood directors, sometimes a Hollywood producer, certain production heads, like a director of photography or a production designer. But also a lot of this was dictated by the foreign union. So one thing I'm interested in is looking at how Hollywood companies would conform to a lot of the foreign regulations, regulations of the international crews. And often that dictated that you could only use perhaps a director, a producer, maybe a cinematographer. The rest of the crew would have to be foreign. And so, I think it's that criteria that led me to kind of define what it is. But I realize, it's a messy time, and I think that's what's really interesting. It's a really transitional time when there is more mixing of financing, more mixing of talent and crews. So, I think this is a way in to look at what was really just a massive internationalization of film in the post-war era.
So is it possible to sort of draw some generalizations about how this phenomenon that you look at transformed what Hollywood films were like?
I think we could take a measured approach to thinking about that. I think one of the things I'm interested in is trying to chart measured change. These films weren't radically different from what was being made in Hollywood, in studios, or even on locations in Southern California. But I think we can see this kind of incremental change in terms of the locations, where there was a greater interest in authenticity and realism, but it was almost as if these filmmakers were kind of taking a studio-style approach to working on location. So again, they're not making neorealist movies or French New Wave movies. So I think that's part of it. But you can also look at the stories, which were certainly more international. It was a lot of movies about Americans abroad. You had a lot of movies dealing with the post-war situation, looking at all the uncertainties of post-war Europe. So I think there was definitely a growing interest in making more international stories, and also thinking about an international marketplace, thinking about how to appeal to international audiences. And by this time, because of television and competition from leisure time activities, audience numbers were going down in the United States. So Hollywood studios had to increasingly rely on foreign audiences to make up that loss.
Do you find that this phenomenon transformed European filmmaking?
I would give a kind of provisional yes. I think that more work has to be done with that, and my hope is that some of the work I've done on this book can lay the groundwork for other historians to look at this, and some people have. But yes, I mean, I think in the European context, because a lot of the industries were devastated by World War II, they were very interested in investment from Hollywood in making sure that crews were being employed. Hollywood did invest in rebuilding a number of studios, kind of most famously Cinecittà. MGM put a lot of money into that infrastructure so it could shoot Quo Vadis there. So it did help the industry, but it also had some negative effects, like increasing production costs in Europe, which made it harder for European productions to compete with some of those, the cost of labor. And so there was also a lot of kind of consternation from the European labor groups in terms of how to deal with this influx of Hollywood productions.
Tell us a couple of these films, sort of most famous Runaway productions.
So I do one case study of Roman Holiday, William Wyler's Roman Holiday, with Audrey Hepburn, and that's kind of one of the more famous of the films of this period. It's also it's a wonderful movie with a great use of locations, and so one of the things I look at is how locations are specifically used in this film, and how they're incorporated into the story, how the kind of display, almost the spectacle of location is motivated in that film. So I think that's a good example. This book is also filled with terrible movies.
Yes.
I think that's one of the realities, I think, of doing this kind of history. But I think it's important to look at sort of bad movies, or what we might call just normal Hollywood films.
Yeah.
A lot of historical epics like Quo Vadis, Ben-Hur. Ben-Hur is actually one of the better ones. You have kind of adventure films like Mutiny on the Bounty, which has some interesting location work, a very odd performance by Marlon Brando, but overall a 3-hour slog. But for all these movies, the production histories are really interesting, and so that's really kind of what drew me to it.
So you're another area of your expertise is global Hollywood.
Right.
And that's not in the subtitle of the book. So what's the difference between, what is global Hollywood as you understand it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a kind of term that's used widely today in cinema and media studies to really think about the global dimensions of Hollywood. I'm careful, my subtitle is internationalizing post-war production, not globalizing. Just because I think globalization, that term is more of a modern usage. But you can certainly make a case that Hollywood and much of the world has been globalized for a long time. But I think that one thing that I'm interested in looking at is a kind of bottom-up approach to thinking about global Hollywood. When people discuss global Hollywood, it inevitably brings up sort of arguments about cultural imperialism. And I'm very interested in those arguments, but also kind of adding a nuance to what does globalization and cultural imperialism look like on the ground. And I think when you study things like labor, when you look at the agency of specific filmmakers, you see it's a bit more complicated. That really, for the time I'm looking at, Hollywood had to adapt to a lot of the regulations and the circumstances of working with international crews, but ultimately in order to attain their kind of aggressive financial goals. So it is very much a kind of model of cultural imperialism, but I think looking at it from the bottom up adds perhaps a slightly different picture, a bit more nuance.
So I'm going to switch some gears now. So as I mentioned at the top of the interview, you were a recent recipient of an OHC teaching fellowship. So tell us about the class you developed using the fellowship.
So this is a class I've long wanted to teach, and it was really focused on style, Hollywood style. And so we looked at different stylistic elements like lighting, Technicolor, widescreen. And what I wanted students to think about is to study the evolution of style. You have to think about the interaction of industry, technological change, and creative choice. So we looked at things like the use of Technicolor in the original Star is Born from 1937 and the way that that movie uses color, which also had to negotiate kind of pressure from the Technicolor Corporation. And there was actually a Technicolor representative, Natalie Kalmus, on set to shape the use of color. So it's that kind of like interesting intersection of industry, creative choice, and kind of corporate pressure that creates style. So that was kind of the questions that we were interested in. But I also was interested in thinking about how to bring digital tools to the study of history. And so thanks to the funding from the Oregon Humanities Center, I was able to develop this video essay component. So I spent a summer learning how to use a software, Adobe Premiere, which is an editing program. So I could teach students to edit video essays. And so video essays are basically edited clips with voiceover. And they would make video essays about sort of the patterns of style in a film. And it was using a lot of just traditional skills that students develop in other classes, like how to formulate an argument, how to do research, but blending it with more of a kind of creative component. And I think, in the cinema studies department, we're really trying to figure out how to blend creative practice with critical thinking. And I think this was an opportunity to explore that.
And how did that component of the course go?
That was the most exciting part, but it was also challenging. I mean, I think it gave me a lot of respect for my colleagues who teach production courses and how hard it is. Yeah. And I know that a lot of our students are really interested in creative work and production, but it's challenging. And I was also interested in giving them very specific parameters and not to let them kind of run wild, but to have to kind of fit within a certain framework, a certain time frame. You had to kind of address very specific issues, and that's hard to do. But I think there were some really excellent video essays. So I think there's just so much potential with exploring that further.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fascinating. It's just a fascinating course. What do you think the students learned?
My hope is that they gained an appreciation for classic Hollywood. So it was mostly focused on classic Hollywood, and that's what my research is really about. And I think in this day and age, it's hard to watch classical Hollywood films, meaning hard to find them. Mm-hmm. If you look at Netflix, there's only there's maybe a dozen classic Hollywood movies. So I think I sort of develop this kind of consternation about, what about the future of film studies when no one has any understanding of classic Hollywood films or film history. So I think that was one of my goals, and I think they at least got a sense of different important filmmakers and important films, and hopefully they'll explore those further. I think also it's important for students to really be good analysts and watch films closely. And so I think looking at style can be a good way into that. And I think that the films that we watch, Star is Born is great. It's not a masterpiece, but there's some other movies that we watched, like Double Indemnity or this great Sam Fuller Western, 40 Guns, that I think are masterpieces, and that they can give students who are interested in filmmaking a lot of ideas. And I hope the students who enjoyed the video essay component, that's something that they can take with them, and that they also learn some skills that they can incorporate into their academic work or creative work. And I should say that a lot of them had taken editing courses or had experience editing. So in some ways, I was trying to catch up with some of them.
And what are some of the kind of comments you got from them at the end of the course?
I think that a lot of them were focused on the video essay component. I think kind of really excited about that, and wanting that to be more of an option in their other courses. I think that's great, and we want to respond to that excitement, but also kind of balance it with making sure that students can write good research papers and make arguments. I think that students were excited about looking at classic Hollywood films, so I think I got some good response on that.
So tell me one or two other classes that you teach.
So a lot of classes reflect kind of my interest in Hollywood, but I'm also interested in contemporary cinema, international cinema. I teach a class on contemporary international art cinema. But one class that I've probably taught the longest since I first came to University of Oregon is a class called Production Studies. And this is a course that looks at how production work doesn't just produce culture, but production work is a culture in itself. So that opens up our ability to think about issues of labor, the working conditions of production. We look at a case study of this camera assistant, Sarah Jones, who was unfortunately killed on a set through just a terrible train accident and total negligence from some of the producers. We look at the issue of gender and why certain positions have historically been gendered, things like casting directors and script supervisors. We also, more recently have had to reckon with the Me Too movement and Time's Up movement to look at a lot of the gender inequities and power imbalances that exist in the film and media industries. I tell students it's going to be a very depressing class, and it is, but the goal is really to identify the problems in the industry, think about solutions, and hopefully inspire students to go out there, work in the industry, and try to change it, make it a better culture.
Fascinating. So we've just got about a minute left. Last question. Tell us about your new project, your new book project.
So it's going to be a sequel to the current book. It's tentatively titled Cross-Border Hollywood, and it's going to look at Hollywood productions that were shot in Mexico from the 40s through the 60s. This was something that I was researching alongside the current book. Mexico was a very different situation than Europe. Mexico had a very protectionist industry that's very concerned about the influx of Hollywood productions. At the same time, in Hollywood, there was probably the most vehement protest against Hollywood films going to Mexico. So there's a political component. Again, it's going to be another study of production, looking at how Hollywood has invested heavily in Mexico, especially during World War II. And it's going to be another look at style and how certain figures, like cinematographer Gabriel Figueroa, trained in Hollywood, went back to Mexico, became a leading cinematographer, worked on a number of Hollywood productions, and kind of created this hybridized style that mixed Hollywood conventions with a kind of Mexican pictorialism. I'm hoping that focusing on one country will be easier than many countries. Also, I'm Colombian American. I grew up speaking Spanish. I look forward to going to Mexico to do research. And I think it'll be easier trying to do research in Spanish than a mix of kind of Romance languages in Europe.
Daniel, thanks for taking the time to speak with us. It's been really interesting.
Thanks so much.
I've been speaking with Daniel Gómez Steinhart, Assistant Professor of Cinema Studies at the University of Oregon. His first book, Runaway Hollywood, Internationalizing Postwar Production and Location Shooting, was published in 2019. As a 2018-19 Oregon Humanities Center Teaching Fellow, Steinhart developed and taught the class Hollywood Film Style during the 2018 fall quarter. Thanks so much for watching.